Hello, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. Not too long ago, I had the opportunity to work with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy and to chat with him a little bit about a lot of different topics. But one of the things that we talked about was whether or not the Gospels are anonymous, and we also spoke of the age of the Gospels. And here's what Michael had to say.
Thank
So
you.
I also want to ask you, what do you take, one of the arguments that I get a lot from atheists, and it kind of is building on some of the questions I'm getting in here, but dating of the New Testament, a lot of, Bart Ehrman spent a lot of time trying to discount the Bible based on its dating, or the idea that the authors are anonymous. I think that's sort of a silly argument because in my opinion, there's nothing in the ancient works that says it's according to somebody else. They say it's according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, and if you look at Mark and you look at Luke, they weren't apostles, so why wouldn't they say it's according to Peter? Something like that. So I'm wondering what your thought is on the anonymous argument and the dating argument.
We'll start with the dating argument. I wish New Testament scholars that are skeptical would talk to Old Testament scholars sometimes because, the New Testament scholars will say, well, these Gospels were written some 40 years after Jesus. How could they have remembered anything? Okay. Have you read any papers on oral tradition? You might want to start there. Because I just read a paper, as I told you, I was reading some stuff on Aboriginal religions. I just read a paper called Aboriginal Memories of Inundation of an Australian Coast dating more than 7,000 years ago. And they're noting that Aboriginals were able to accurately preserve oral traditions that lasted for 7,000 years. Okay, so I think 40 years is fine. I think John is fine writing at the end of the century. He probably remembered what happened. Let's give them a break on there. I don't understand the arguments that they would not have remembered anything. It's a ridiculous argument in light of a study of oral traditions and how reliable they can be. Even other studies have shown that oral traditions can be reliable for like 150 years. Some have shown 800 years. Okay, so let's be a little more gracious there. In terms of the anonymous argument, I mentioned that in my New Testament series, part 4 specifically, that that was sort of a cultural norm in some ways to not necessarily mention the author and write yourself in third person. So Josephus writes about himself in third person. So does Xenophon. So does Caesar. And so in terms of mentioning the author, sometimes the authors didn't sign their name. Like Tacitus did not sign his name on the annals. The only reason we know Tacitus wrote the annals is because St. Jerome told us 300 years later. And every copy we have of the annals says of Tacitus. So, that's just something that you do. You don't necessarily, it's a high context society. You don't necessarily have to write that. But I would remind people that it's unanimous when it comes to the Gospels. So every source we have says it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And look at some of our sources. So Clement of Alexandria says that Matthew and Luke came before Mark. Well, Irenaeus implies it was Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, and John. Irenaeus gets different details than what he gets from Papias. So you have all these different details. But they all agree that the authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we have corroborating evidence from different traditions, different lines. Irenaeus has got a different story. He thinks, Jesus died under Claudius. So he didn't get the same information Papias got. Papias has different information than Clement of Alexandria. But they all still agree that the gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have good corroborating evidence, and I think skeptics overlook that.
So he makes a great point right there. And so I want you to remember that when you're listening to people like Bart Ehrman, who likes to get out there and try to make the claim that the Gospels are anonymous, and there was this telephone game because he plants a lot of seeds in what they call gaslighting, but his gaslighting doesn't pan out because we have no ancient sources attributing the Gospels to anyone else other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Very basic information. I think it takes more faith to retain positions that are anti that position than for it. Thank you very much for coming. Please like, subscribe, and come again.